night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. There's a great piece in Counterpunch entitled Genocide Files from Pequots to Palestinians from so-called Manifest Destiny to Gaza River. And in this piece, the author, Professor Alfred de Zayas, quotes Dr. King from the book, Why We Can't Wait, quote, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society," end quote. Professor de Zayas then asks, has our mentality changed? Are we ready to reject the philosophy of manifest destiny? Have we developed our faculty of self-criticism and started to realize the enormity of the crime committed on the indigenous of North and South America? Well, for answers and many others, let's connect some dots.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze these events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is America is perhaps the only nation that tried, as a matter of policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, and this to me is so profound, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. My question is the Zionist state of Palestine following in our footsteps? Let's ask my guest. Alfred de Zayas is a law professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and served as a UN independent expert on international order from 2012 to 2018. He's the author of 12 books, including Building a Just World Order. Professor Alfred de Zayas, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon to all listeners. Indeed, you quoted one of my heroes, Martin Luther King Jr., and on page 141 of this book, Why We Can't Wait, you find that sentence: our country was born in genocide. And Martin Luther King Jr. is a moral instance. We know him as a preacher, as a religious man. We know him as a thinker, as a great orator. And he is trying to wake up in the American people a sense of conscience, a sense of regret, a sense that we must make amends for the crimes committed by prior generations. I mean, I don't believe in collective guilt. I don't believe in going around just downcast because our ancestors may or may not have participated in these crimes. But we must at least recognize that an enormous, really cosmic injustice was done to the First Nations of the United States. And the same thing is repeating now in Gaza and in Palestine. The Palestinian people, who for thousands and thousands of years have been living where they live, their homelands are Palestine. Their homelands are this area which now is occupied by Israel. And they've been subjected to apartheid. President Jimmy Carter. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book, Our Endangered Values, in which he goes into these issues. And he wrote many books, actually. He wrote this book, Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. He calls it apartheid because it is apartheid. The kind of discrimination, segregation, humiliation that the Palestinian people have endured since the Nakba, since 1947. Mm-hmm. It's something that, unfortunately, the mainstream media in the United States, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, tend to ignore, gloss over, downplay, or even justify. And we all want peace in Palestine. We all want a just peace in Palestine. It becomes, of course, all the more difficult when you have an occupier who has actually committed genocide on this population, this hostage population. And you hear in the political narrative, you hear that Israel has a right to defend itself. Now, I am not questioning Israel's right to exist. Israel exists. There it is. But Palestine exists too. And the Palestinians have been there for thousands of years. They have a right to homeland. The United Nations, since the partition resolution 181, has been insisting, okay, there should be two states. Should be a Israeli state and a Palestinian state. Now, Israel has spent 76 years making the existence of a Palestinian state and the membership of Palestine in the United Nations impossible. This, by the way, is contrary to all the negotiations that preceded the emergence of Israel in 1948. There were essentially three conditions, one of them being respect of the rights of the indigenous population, being the Palestinians. One of them was accepting a Palestinian state next to them. Another one was, of course, determining the frontiers. This whole dispute with Lebanon is because Israel didn't want to accept any borders drawn by the United Nations and just simply wanted to conquer territory. I mean, if there's an aggressor state in the Middle East, it's Israel. But what do we hear in the press in the United States and also in Europe? Israel is the only democratic country in the Middle East. I mean, we are all complicit in the genocide because we have been justifying it. We have provided over decades the means to exterminate the Palestinian people. We have provided military, political, economic, diplomatic, propagandistic support to a genocidal state. And the narrative is so false that it shocks me. Now, you read Jewish Voice for Peace. They think exactly like I do, exactly like the United Nations rapporteurs do. I mean, I've discussed this matter with the UN rapporteurs on Palestine, including John Dugard, Richard Falk, who is Jewish, Michael Link, Professor Michael Link, Canadian professor, the current mandate holder, Francesca Albanese. I've been with her a couple of times on panels. And it is clear that what has gone on since the beginning is a war on the Palestinians, is ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Back in 1975, when I was
hold on 1 second, because let me ask you to incorporate into that analysis in this point from your piece. America is perhaps the only nation that tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. And with that, I would say many would ask about Palestine. What about South Africa? And I think, well, let me not put words in your mouth. If you could speak to that point.
Well, without a doubt, the European migrants to the new continent exterminated the 10 million indigenous population. I'm talking about the Pequots, I'm talking about the Iroquois and the Algonquins and the Mohawks and the Sioux and the Dakotas and Lakotas and Hopis and Squamish and Tlingits, etc. Now, this is a huge, huge crime. And one of the great criminals who perpetrated this crime was our president, Andrew Jackson, who raises our $20 bill. And we actually not only have raised this genocidal policy to the DNA of the United States. Manifest destiny means that the good God has given us this continent to conquer and to occupy from coast to coast, notwithstanding the fact that the continent was inhabited. I mean, 10 million indigenous used to live in the continent. And when I was young, back in 1970, I hitchhiked from New York to California just to get to see the country. And it was a magnificent experience. And the one thing that I remember most is not just the beauty of the mountains and the rivers and the lakes, but the fact that most mountains and rivers and lakes and towns and villages bore indigenous names, not English names or French names, but indigenous names. And I'm talking about tens of thousands of names. I mean, the entire continent was inhabited. And the only thing we have left is the names of these rivers and these mountains. And now Mount Denali in Alaska is being renamed Mount McKinley.
And the Gulf of Mexico is the Gulf of America.
It's laughable. It is absolutely, I don't know, it is almost vulgar.
Well, it would be laughable if it weren't so pathetic.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have to do things like that.
Right.
Why is Trump doing things that are thoroughly unnecessary, that make his administration ridiculous in the eyes of the world, and does not advance the interests of the American people? I mean, what I want Trump to do is to make sure that education in the United States is up to par.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare, infrastructure. I mean, buildings collapse. Bridges fall into the Mississippi. I mean, I've read that again and again. It is pathetic that there's no maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
You have natural disasters, but you have to be ready to address natural disasters, because there will be tornadoes and there will be hurricanes and there will be more Katrinas. So you'd better be ready to address those crises preventively. That's what I would like to see the American government do, and not waste our time with fantasies of acquiring Canada or acquiring Greenland. We don't need that. I mean, if there's anything imperialistic in the world, that is it. So the man is a megalomaniac and a dangerous one, but that does not mean that it would have been, shall we say, safer.
Let me jump in, shifting gears a bit.
Sure.
I was listening to MSNBC this morning, and they were talking about the Secretary of Defense and his comments, I think in Geneva, and Donald Trump reaching out to President Putin in the 90-minute telephone conversation that they had. And the commentator made the statement. No, actually, it wasn't MSNBC, it was NPR.
Yeah.
And the commentator made the statement that the United States has to push back against Russian imperialism. Well, thank you for laughing. I don't have to continue. Go ahead.
It is just too ridiculous, but we have been subjected to that kind of narrative for decades upon decades. And the problem is that we, normal human beings, we want to believe. I think it's good that you believe in something. You should not be a nihilist. You want to believe that your country is okay, that your country is good, that your country is ethical, and that they know what you're doing. I mean, now, what is the situation? You learn that you were lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You learn again and again that the United States government deliberately has lied to the people. And we continue forgiving the government for doing these things. Now, long ago, I withdrew the blind trust that I had for the federal government. I thought that our presidents were moral people. Well, I do think that Jimmy Carter was a good president, and I very much respect him. I think that Dwight Eisenhower had the best interests of the country in mind, but the majority of our presidents either are megalomaniacs or are opportunists with great economic interests, and they have enriched themselves at the expense of the people. Now, all I expect from a democratic society is that they make an effort to inform themselves that they shouldn't believe any propaganda or any public relations that tells us that we are the good guys by definition and that what our government does is necessarily good. It isn't. We must develop at least a minimum of a faculty of self criticism. And we should not just celebrate how good we are. I still remember the question addressed to George W. Bush after the fateful, horrible, criminal 9/11 attacks of the World Trade Center. And the question was, why do they hate us?
Right.
And his answer was simply flabbergasting.
Mm-hmm.
He said, they hate us because we are good.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, try again. I mean, don't you think that we have been provoking the world? We have been exploiting the world. We have been imperialists vis-a-vis the rest of the world for decades upon decades. The conservative columnist and former presidential candidate for the Conservative Party, Patrick Buchanan. Now, I've read many books by Patrick Buchanan. I know him personally. He's a delightful Irish American.
Mm-hmm.
He is a really honest, good, true blue American. And in one of his many books, he said, they came to us because we went to them.
Mm-hmm.
That is, we have been meddling in world affairs in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. We have been sticking our noses into things that were none of our concern, and people resent that. It's only normal and understandable that an Iraqi, an Iranian, an Afghan, a Kazakhstani, a South African, an Ugandan doesn't hold us in great esteem. The motto of Mr. Trump, make America great again. Now, were we ever great, or were we just bullies? Were we ever great in the sense of being benefactors of the world? I'm not so sure of that. We have been exploiting humanity for centuries. Now, I wouldn't care to make America great again. I would like to see America respected, admired, even loved, but not great. I mean, great implies just sheer power. Might is right. And if we want to make America respected, how about reviving the legacy of a great American woman, Eleanor Roosevelt? How about reviving that spirit that gave birth to the United Nations, that spirit that gave birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? That would make America believable in the world. And what do? We insult everybody, and we decide unilaterally that we're going to leave the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. That's one of the stupid decisions that Trump did back in 2017, and he's done it again. So what's the meaning of all of that? I mean, the Human Rights Council is there to try to coordinate actions for the progressive implementation of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights in the entire world. That requires international solidarity. And the United States belongs in the Human Rights Council. On the other hand, in my 6 years as rapporteur, I must say the United States delegation was mostly destructive. Every time there was a positive, progressive initiative from some part of the world, the United States opposed it. And I'm talking concretely. I'm talking about the Declaration on the Human Right to Peace. The United States eviscerated the text because I worked on the text of the advisory committee of the Human Rights Council. And that text was very thorough and guaranteed sustainable peace for the world. We had planned on an observatory. We had planned on all sorts of actions that the United Nations could take, for instance, in the field of self-determination of peoples, early warning, resolving grievances before they fester and become a threat to the international peace and security. Well, the United States essentially killed it. What was eventually adopted was less than we already had in resolution of 1984. That was the resolution on the right of all peoples to live in peace. And that one had gone through the General Assembly very well. In any event, we ended up in 2016-17 having less than we had in 1984. And that was thanks to the manipulations, the bullying, the arm twisting of the United States. So the fact that the United States is no longer in the Human Rights Council is not a loss. Of course, the United States is not going to abandon its bullying of other states. It's quite clear that if there is an important resolution to be adopted, that the American ambassador will be calling the ambassador of African countries and Asian countries and say, don't you dare vote against us, or don't you dare vote for a resolution that we are against. So the kind of blackmail will continue, but at least we will be spared the hypocrisy and the false arguments and the false narratives that the U.S. delegation always gave in the Human Rights Council.
Talking about hypocrisy, and Mel, thank you for that super sticker. Greatly appreciate it. In talking about that hypocrisy, America, the Western press has vilified Vladimir Putin as a dictator, as an authoritarian, as a strong man, seemingly not to understand that Russia does have a parliament, that they do have elections, and they put President Xi Jinping in the same context. The Western press never wants to put World War II in a context of Russia lost 27 million people compared to the United States losing 400,000. And when you lose 27 million, and Putin's family was part of that 27 million, that's going to give you a different worldview. The Western press does not seem to understand that Russia or the Soviet Union was anti-imperialist. They don't want to talk about the Maidan coup. They don't want to talk about the Minsk Accords. They don't want to talk about James Baker's promise to Gorbachev about NATO will not move any further west towards the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union agrees to the reunification of Germany. None of these data points seem to matter. And the name of this show is Connecting the Dots. Am I off base? Am I screaming just rhetoric BS in terms of, don't these realities matter?
Well, you are in good company, because you are saying what we already know from a number of books by Professor John Mearsheimer
Mm-hmm.
of the University of Chicago. You are saying the same things that we know from Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, and Professor Stephen Kinzer of Boston, and Professor Dan Kowalik of Pittsburgh, and the late Professor Francis Boyle of Illinois. I don't know whether you know that he passed away 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, in
And
fact, I wanted to get to him at the end of the show, but
Yeah.
also to let you know he has been on this show.
This is a very thorough book on Palestine by Francis Boyle. He's also written books on NATO
Mm-hmm.
and the threat that NATO poses for humanity, because it is NATO's provocations, it is NATO's constant escalation, it is NATO's imperialism that provokes other countries to some kind of a pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And I must say, you are on the right track, and so is Glenn Greenwald, and so is Max Blumenthal,
Right.
and so is Aaron Mate, and so is Amy Goodman of Democracy Now. Now, Putin's invasion of the 24th of February 2022 was eminently provoked.
Mm-hmm.
Now, breach of
Well, wait a minute. Can you even, because of its provocation, can you even call it an invasion?
Well, the thing is, he considered, and I think he was correct, because now we know the extent of the rearming of Ukraine, the offensive rearming of Ukraine against Russia, because the whole idea, and one day when the classified documents are released, we will know that what was behind it was this fantasy
Mm-hmm.
that you could dismember Russia, make lots of little states out of it, and then American transnational corporations would go in and have a bonanza with the enormous natural resources of Russia, rare earths, and of course oil and gas and gold and everything that they have. So Russia is enormously wealthy in natural resources, and we want it for us.
Mm-hmm.
So the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN have done an enormous undemocratic disservice to the American people by suppressing half of the story, not to say 80% of the story, but in any event, crucial elements that a democratic society needs to make a rational judgment over a situation are withheld. So you have no other choice. But as I do, I read 6 languages, including Russian. I consult RT and Sputnik and Russia in the original.
Mm-hmm.
I consult the Dutch press and the Arabic press and the Chinese press, etc. And I make my own synthesis of everything that I read. So I do read every day CNN. I do read the BBC. I want to know what they are saying, where they place priorities.
Mm-hmm.
But then I complement that with all the other information that I get. I also have a lot of experience with Russia because when I was in the United Nations in the Secretariat, I was a high official. I was Secretary of the Human Rights Committee. I was Chief of Petitions. That's the equivalent of being registrar of all the complaints procedures, as the case may be. I represented the Secretary General in the Baltic states on an issue of Russian minorities in the Baltic states.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote 2 reports for the Secretary General and for the Security Council, actually. And they were very well received, interestingly enough. I'm talking about 1992 and 1993. In this connection, I had the opportunity of going several times to Moscow and to be with the then Russian foreign minister, Kosyrev, at the time. Let me see. I have a photo with him. Yeah, here he is. That's Kosyrev. Me with still brown hair. Yeah. Well, that had to go sometime. And as the case may be, I really got to know the Russian people because I would go and speak to them on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
I got to know the Ukrainian people. Back in 1994, I was the representative of the Secretary General for the parliamentary elections in March, and then for the presidential elections in June 1994, which means I got to see that time the incumbent President Kravchuk and also the challenger Kuchma. I had the opportunity by the way, I speak with them in Russian. I mean, there's relatively little difference in the language. There's different spelling, etc., but you can have no problem speaking with Ukrainians, and Ukrainians have no problem speaking with you as long as you speak correct Russian. But what did I learn in which I crisscrossed the country?
Mm-hmm.
I learned that, of course, the vast majority of the population in Crimea was Russian, not Ukrainian.
Right. They're called ethnic Russians.
Yeah. 11% of the population was Ukrainian. And historically, there was no links between Ukraine and Crimea. Had always been Russian since Catherine the Great.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to see the president of the then autonomous Republic of Crimea. And the first thing that he tells me, I'm just going to come and show my credentials. I'm here to observe the elections in Simferopol and observe re-elections in Sebastopol and in Yalta. And he says, Господин de Zayas, а ты знаешь, а мы русские. And I said, I don't care that you're Russians. I'm here not to give you self-determination. I'm not here with a mandate to determine whether you're entitled to independence. I'm here only to observe the elections. But 20 years later, after the Maidan putsch, after the coup d'etat of 22nd of February 2014, that came back to mind when it said that we are Russians, because they felt Russian. And the same thing goes for the Russians of the Donbass, for the Russians of Lugansk, for the Russians of Donetsk. There, again, about 75% of the population was Russian. And in the other regions, the region of Kherson and the region of Zaporizhia, it's less. It's more like 60%. But in any event, I've always been of the opinion that the right of self-determination of peoples is a conflict prevention strategy. Try to address self-determination grievances in an early stage. You might succeed in solving them by having a federal arrangement in the state, whereby a region that is a significant majority or minority, that they can have a degree of autonomy so that they can enjoy their language, their culture, their traditions,
their religion,
etc. And so the narrative that we get from the New York Times and the Washington Post is fake news, fake history, fake law, fake democracy, fake diplomacy. It's so surrealistic when you know another narrative, and it is the alternative media in the United States that has the potential to help the American people to realize that they have been systematically lied to.
Let me ask you this, and thank you, Carl, for your $20 super sticker. Greatly appreciate that. To your point, I think I want you to let me know if my interpretations of this are off point. Today, it's reported that Donald Trump called Putin and spoke to him for 90 minutes. And during the course of that conversation, they said a couple of things that, to me, the way that this was presented spoke volumes. One, Donald Trump said, I'm going to talk to Vladimir Putin in Saudi Arabia, and then I've been invited to Russia. Well, to me, the one that goes first, the protocol of all of this, to me, is very important. The one that goes first is making the concession. And if Trump goes to see Putin before Putin comes to see Trump, that's an incredibly important signal.
It is.
The other thing that stood out to me was they said after Putin spoke to Trump or Marco Rubio, somebody in the administration called Zelensky and gave Zelensky the update on the call. So Zelensky is now no longer in the conversation. He's a passive observer. He's no longer a major participant.
Well, Zelensky, as everybody knows, is no longer the legitimate president.
Correct. His term has expired.
Expired in May.
And his power defaulted to the Rada, even though Ukraine is in the midst of a war. He what's the term I'm looking for when the president martial law. Martial law does not retain the power in Ukraine, does not retain the power to Zelensky. No. The presidential power goes to the Rada.
Of course. Okay. But Europe, especially Europe, put all of its eggs in this NATO basket.
Wait a minute. And another point they made is that, and this came from either Hegseth or came from Rubio, Ukrainian inclusion in NATO will not happen. That says to me, war over, Russia wins.
Well, I wouldn't say Russia wins.
Okay.
Russia has lost tens of thousands of soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians. In Kursk, there have been horrible war crimes committed by Ukrainian forces against the Russian population in Kursk and against the population in Lugansk and Donetsk and Zaporizhia, etc. By the way, you don't get that in the New York Times.
Let me just quickly say the reason I say Russia wins is because Putin has been very consistent with three demands. No, Ukraine will not join NATO. You won't have NATO missiles in Ukraine, and you have to denazify Ukraine. So, in terms of those three security statements by Putin, that's what I meant by that statement.
Yeah, there's one more element. That's the element of self-determination.
Yes.
I wrote a report for the General Assembly back in 2014 on the theory and practice of the right of self-determination of peoples. And I established 15 criteria who can invoke the right of self-determination, how to invoke it, and the distinction between internal self-determination and external self-determination, etc. Now, the New York Times never considers that the Russian population in Crimea and the Russian population, the majority Russian population in the Donbass, has a right of self-determination. And this is a crucial element and was a crucial element in the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements were good. I read them. If Ukraine had respected the Minsk agreements, we would not have had a war. And in December 2021, 2 months before the outbreak of the war, Lavrov put on the table 2 draft treaties on mutual security. Now, the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine was guaranteed. And the quid pro quo was that Ukraine would not go into NATO and Ukraine would remain neutral. Now, that was a very generous, logical, rational draft treaty. And Jens Stoltenberg and Antony Blinken and Joe Biden dismissed them without even considering them. And I remember the words of Jens Stoltenberg at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022. He said, well, this Mr. Putin, he doesn't want NATO at his frontiers. Well, I have news for Putin. He's not going to have less NATO. He's going to have a lot more NATO. And everything, even the tone of voice was so aggressive, so provocative. And it's like when you take your gauntlet and you throw it in front of your opponent and your opponent picks it up. And that's what Putin said. I said, you can't deal with these people. They're hopeless. They're absolutely hopeless. They're liars, they're cheaters, and they just want to come up to our frontiers. They want to encircle us, and they want to threaten us. And if they had continued, the next would have been Georgia. And then Russia would have been even more encircled. And so Putin made the fateful decision. Basically, as an international lawyer, I condemn the decision because I'm a pacifist. And I consider Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter to be not only hard law, but the hardest kind of hard law, what is called in international law jargon, jus cogens.
I'm sorry, say that again. It's called?
Jus cogens.
Thank you.
It's binding.
Yes.
And you cannot escape it. So I would have preferred that he would have persevered and not invaded.
Mm-hmm.
But I can understand it.
There we go.
What he did
There we go.
was a preemptive war because as time went by.
Well, wait a minute. Because before you get there, before we get to February 24th of 22, don't we have to go to, I think it was April or May of 21, when Ukraine sent about 100,000 troops to the Russian border?
Yeah.
And Putin called Joe Biden and said, you either remove those troops from my border or my response is going to be asymmetrical and disproportionate. And that is, and Biden listened, because Biden got scared. And Biden called Zelensky and told Zelensky, get those troops off the border. And
well,
that element never gets discussed.
No.
In the reality of the provocation.
Yeah, because it just does not fit the narrative. So you keep it out.
There you go.
But
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
At the reports of the OSCE, the OSCE had a special mission in Ukraine and in the Donbass, and they were monitoring violations of the Minsk agreements. These violations from Ukrainian side multiplied by 10 in January and February of 2022. And also beginning of January 2022, Zelensky signed an order to take the Donbass and Crimea by force.
Mm-hmm.
He had received so many weapons from Europe and from the United States that he thought he could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And he signs the order, and obviously the Russians know that. So the Russians bring in his 100,000 troops, and they still hope to the last minute that they can avoid the use of force. And in the end, the fateful decision is taken, and the war begins. But I say, this war, the Ukraine war,
mm-hmm.
did not start in 22. It started on the 22nd of February 14. It started with the illegal, unconstitutional, undemocratic coup d'etat.
The Maidan coup.
Against a democratically elected president. Who, by
Thank you, the United States.
He was a softie because he agreed to negotiate. He didn't want to throw the army against the demonstrators. He didn't want bloodshed. So when they came to him on the 21st of February of 2014, he agreed to have advanced elections and to have an orderly transition of power if indeed he was not reelected.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose the Maidan group was not homegrown. These were financed by Europe and by the United States.
Thank you, Samantha Power.
They realized that they had maybe a slim majority in Kiev proper,
mm-hmm.
and in the west in Lvov. But in the entire Ukrainian territory, I don't think they had the majority. I think that they would have lost the election again.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want that. They wanted by all means to topple the legitimate government. And France, Poland, Germany had guaranteed that treaty that was signed on the 21st of February. And the ink wasn't even dry when on the 22nd of February, the next day, the Maidan radicals wanted to take over the presidential palace and kill Yanukovych.
Mhm.
And Yanukovych was lucky enough to be able to be flown out of it. So this was a, shall we say, vulgar coup d'etat like we know them in Latin America. The United States organizes so many overthrows, like everybody remembers Salvador Allende in September. By the way, September 11. It was September 11, 1973. So added to the list. By the way, Stephen Kinzer, Professor Stephen Kinzer of Boston, has this wonderful book with the title Overthrow.
Yes, I have it.
It deals, with from Hawaii to today, and all of these coups that the United States has organized, and partly through U.S. aid and the National Endowment for Democracy, because these organizations that have very nice sounding names, these organizations are there to subvert governments, are there to prepare the ground for a so-called color revolution and to install some neoliberal government that will do our bidding, and not to have a sovereign government that does what the people in those countries actually want.
Let me because our time is running. If you can give me a few more minutes, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Sure.
Cherie asks, I think, a very good question. Right now, we have a fear-driven democracy. Why?
Well, that is part of the psychology of it. If you read 1984, you realize that this dystopia of George Orwell depended on, shall we say, groupthink. You had to instill fear in the population and hatred in the population. You may recall in 1984, the exercises that they had in Hate Week. In Hate Week, they had to go and demonstrate against their enemies. So, of course, the enemies changed every time. The government determined who's going to be the enemy this week. But you had to keep the population in between fear and hatred. And unfortunately, we live in a dystopia. And I think we would have been in just a dystopia under Kamala Harris and her new government. Unfortunately, that's why, as I said, I didn't vote Trump. I didn't vote Kamala. I voted Dr. Jill Stein, because at least Dr. Jill Stein is rational. Dr. Jill Stein is rational, and she doesn't want wars, and she wants, to bring back democracy to the United States. But we started talking about Gaza, and again, the book by Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé has another wonderful book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And they all argue about the necessity of reaching a sustainable peace in the area.
Wait a minute. Before we get back to Palestine, let's finish the discussion about the United States and Russia with Kevin Baptiste. Thank you, Kevin, for that super sticker. And he asked the question, do you feel that Trump will yield to the tongue with regards to Putin instead of baring his teeth?
Russia and Ukraine take the backseat in the priorities of Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants to focus on China and the challenge, basically the economic challenge that China poses to American manufacturing and American economy in general. Now, showing our teeth. We have been showing our teeth for 20 years in Afghanistan, and we lost miserably. We were showing our teeth in Vietnam for 50 years, and we lost miserably. Now, the only logical thing to do is to turn the page. It is easy for Trump. He didn't start this mess. Biden was Obama, and this Victoria Nuland, I was looking for an adjective, and I decided rather not say that. It was censored. But Trump didn't want sanctions against Russia. Trump didn't want a war with Russia. He knew that we had provoked it, and he understands that we had provoked it. And Biden, Blinken, and Hillary Clinton, and the whole Democratic establishment have decided, for their own reasons, that you can make a lot of money for the military-industrial complex if you keep this war going. So it's good for business. So let's keep the war going. And then in order to justify that to the American people, you say we have to be strong because Russia is posing a threat to the United States. Not at all. Not at all. Russia wanted nothing better than being incorporated into the West. When
they wanted to join NATO.
Of course they did, and they asked, and they were told no. I mean, the idea is that NATO, in order to continue existing, NATO needed the argument that it was a defensive alliance. And to be a defensive alliance, you have to defend against somebody. So you have to create an enemy. Now, when that enemy basically gives up, dismantles the Warsaw Pact, withdraws all of its troops, etc., you have no enemy more. Russia does not want to be an enemy of the United States. Russia wants to do business with Europe, wants to do business with the United States. But for the military-industrial complex, for the wheels of business to continue turning, we need an enemy. So Russia got assigned with this function or this role, which Russia doesn't want to play. And Trump can walk away from it because it's not his fault. This was Obama with Biden, and this was Biden with the war against Putin in 22. So he can wash his hands of it. But on the other hand, in the Middle East, Trump is completely wrong on the facts, on the history, and on the law. He doesn't realize that if you were to allow resettlement of the native population of Gaza, you would be denying the Nuremberg principles. You would be denying the very clear condemnation by the Nuremberg Tribunal of the Germans for expelling 800,000 Poles from the Warthegau, which was an area that used to belong to Germany, to the Reich before the First World War, but was given to Poland at the Paris Peace Agreement. And then, well, Germany took it back, and the Poles that had moved in were just shipped off. And so that was considered to be a war crime under Article 6B and a crime against humanity under Article 6C. So what happens with this jurisprudence? What happens with the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice that called the ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia genocide? The jurisprudence in the case Bosnia and Herzegovina against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the condemnation of Srebrenica. Now, we've had many Srebrenicas in Gaza. You cannot just simply wash it away. And international law is so clear on the issue. The International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion of the 9th of July, 2004, and again in its second advisory opinion of the 19th of July 2024, made it very clear that Israel's occupation is illegal, that Israel must withdraw from all of these territories, and that Israel must pay compensation to the victims. And the victims are the Palestinians, the Gaza population.
Mm-hmm.
Here again, manipulation of history. People tell you the war in the Middle East is because Hamas committed crimes on the 7th of October 2023. But the war started in 1947. Israel has been committing ethnic cleansing, apartheid, discrimination, segregation of the Palestinians for 76 years. And Israel, by the way, does not have a right of self-defense against the Palestinians. International law is very clear.
Mm-hmm.
Self-defense,
yes,
triggers in when state A attacks state B.
Preach.
But when state A is the occupier and the rebellion, the revolt, is coming from the occupied, oppressed, subjected people of Gaza. It is same as in 1943 with the Warsaw Ghetto. There were 400,000 Jews, packed into the Warsaw Ghetto, surrounded by the Nazis, by the SS, and they attempted to break out. They attempted to free themselves from this encirclement. And what happened is that they were massacred by the Nazis. And of course, that was a crime against humanity. So here the situation is Gaza has been suffering under an illegal blockade by Israel since 2007. So when the war starts, or rather when this particular phase of the war breaks out on the 7th of October 2023, the Palestinian people had endured 17 years of an illegal blockade. Those 17 years of the illegal blockade had enormous humanitarian consequences. I mean, people died because of lack of medicine, because of lack of medical care, because of lack of access to dialysis and all social things that wouldn't come in because of the blockade. And of course, some died out of lack of sufficient nourishment.
Mm-hmm.
I think the brutality, the illegality of that blockade is something that you have to factor in. But in any event, General Assembly Resolution 2625, the Friendly Relations Resolution, General Assembly Resolution 3314, both of them recognize the right of an oppressed people, of a people living under occupation, to resist with lethal force against this illegal occupation. And the fact that it is illegal has been stated clearly by the International Court of Justice. So here you have Israel that is completely an outlaw. And what can you do? Well, obviously you can break diplomatic relations with Israel, and Israel will laugh at you. They don't care. But if you break commercial relations, say if you have 50, 100 countries that say, we don't want to deal with a genocidal state, we're not going to buy anything from this genocidal state. We're not going to sell anything to this genocidal state. That hurts. That should be done. Of course, symbolically, the General Assembly could and should do the following. The accreditation of Israeli diplomats depends on the accreditation committee of the General Assembly. Back in 1974, the accreditation committee refused to accept the accreditation of the South African apartheid government. They said, you are not a democratic country, you don't represent the majority of the population, so we would accept a delegation once apartheid is over. So for a period of 20 years, South Africa was completely out of the United Nations system, could not vote, could not speak, etc., etc. That would further isolate Israel. The other thing is divestment. I mean, my university, Harvard University, has a huge investment in Israel. And so do many other universities and pension plans, et cetera, et cetera. With all of these foundations or organizations would divest from Israel, that would hurt the Israeli economy. And then Israel would have no choice but to seek a quid pro quo, to seek a compromise. But as I said, Jimmy Carter already back in 2004 laid it out. This is an important book. Palestine Peace, not apartheid. He has a blueprint for peace. Yes. He has a roadmap for peace, but those who are fanatical, shall we say, ideologues, don't want to hear it. And good Jimmy Carter had to suffer a lot of mobbing, a lot of harassment because of this book. And I wish for the Israeli people, like other professors like Ilan Pape, who is an Israeli, like Richard Falk, who is Jewish, like Jeffrey Sachs, who's also Jewish. These
Norman Finkelstein.
These are people who have ethics. These are people who have a conscience. And they are enormously pained by the thought that a country that had suffered the enormity of the Holocaust, that this same country, these same people are now complicit in a genocide against another people. So you can imagine how that hurts.
Let me jump in, and because you mentioned the Warsaw Ghetto and the atrocities that were committed there, and that made me think about Benjamin Netanyahu's family name being Milikowski, not Netanyahu. And as I understand the story, Benjamin Milikowski, who we now know as Netanyahu, his grandfather, it was Polish, and the family came to the region in like 1922, 1923, and they Arabized their name, which was all a part of this whole Zionist ethos and mindset. And the Netanyahus are not the only one. I think Golda Meir.
The bulk of the Israeli population is not even Semitic. The bulk of the Israeli population is Ashkenazi.
Correct.
The Ashkenazis were the Eastern European Jews who actually converted to Judaism, but essentially they are Slavs. they are a Slavic people. That's why there's so many Jews that we know in the United States who have beautiful blue eyes and they're blonde or red haired, and because they're Slavs. Now, of course, through a Slavic Jew will marry a Sephardic Jew from Morocco, Spain, Portugal, or whatever, and then you have a probably prettier color, like chocolate. But it is true that they don't have, shall we say, a historical link to the land of Israel. They are not children.
Contrary to their narrative and claim.
Exactly. I mean, I would say the majority of Israelis are not children of Israel. They're not children of Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Isaac, etc. But again, they have a right to exist, huh? And they're very proud of their heritage. And I must say, I am a fan of so many historical Jewish intellectuals and figures like Baruch Spinoza in Holland. I've been to the Spinoza museums in The Hague and Amsterdam and Rijnsburg frequently. I think he's one of the top philosophers in Europe. Right up there with Immanuel Kant and right up there with Hegel and all the others. Now, I'm a fan of Jewish musicians. Yehudi Menuhin, whom I heard was just out of this world, and of course Vladimir Horowitz and Rubinstein and Leonard Bernstein. I mean, their contribution to the arts is enormous, and I enjoy that. I have internalized that. For me, I mean, Leonard Bernstein was a great figure who contributed a lot to culture. But that does not mean, and I don't think that Bernstein would be in agreement with Netanyahu. Huh? I don't think that the Jewish personalities that I know personally would have any sympathy with this man who is actually an anachronism. He is a walking, talking obsolescence. I mean, the Zionist ideal was already obsolete when it was conceived. It was basically a racial conception whose day had passed. But the Holocaust then triggered the search for a homeland, and that's what made Exodus, and that's what made Israel possible. But I must say one more thing. What the General Assembly could do. You may recall that in 1975, the General Assembly adopted by an overwhelming majority a resolution that said very simply, Zionism is a form of racism. That resolution was enforced for 16 years. And then in 1991, in the euphoria of the Berlin Wall falling down and the Soviet Union dissolving and the hopes of world peace, etc., there was Israel waving the olive branch and, giving the impression that they finally are going to cooperate and they're finally going to allow the Palestinians to have their state. So the world does this gesture and gives them a gift. Resolution 46/86, and they withdraw the prior resolution, Zionism is racism. Well, today, the situation is that Zionism has led to genocide. So it's much worse than just racism.
Preach.
Zionism has led to genocide. So what about the General Assembly adopting a resolution revisiting its old resolution and saying it's much worse than we thought back in 1975. And we want Israel just out. You know that Article 6 of the UN Charter allows a country to be expelled.
Mm-hmm.
If a country is in open rebellion against the United Nations Charter and against the decisions, very clear decisions and orders of the International Court of Justice, then Article 6 applies and Israel could be expelled. But there's a little sentence that says this must be approved by
the Security Council.
That will be blocked.
Right.
But the mere fact that the General Assembly would invoke Article 6 and expel Israel symbolically would hurt very much, because that would make it easier for countries in the world to break commercial relations. You have to persuade governments to do something. It is obscene how we are watching how genocide unfolds and we do nothing about it. We talk about it, but we do nothing about it. It's like when we watched the genocide in Rwanda, when we watched the ethnocide in Cambodia and did nothing. I mean, this is serious. I mean, if we consider ourselves to be civilized, if we consider ourselves to have any values and ethics, we cannot just simply look the other way as if this were not happening. So,
hence the huge mistake that Kamala Harris and the Democrats made in 2024, not even allowing a Palestinian voice at the convention in Chicago. Huge mistake. Let me I know our time is running short, and flat.
My wife just came to the door and said, says here it is 10:23 in the evening, and we usually go to bed by 10:30. So she came through the door and this.
I don't want to fight with your wife. Final point. Flat Earth says it's a tragedy that all the Arabs have abandoned Palestine. And I think that's a great point, particularly with the King of Jordan, Abdullah II, in Washington talking to Donald Trump. If you could give 2 minutes on that, and then we'll say goodnight.
I never thought very highly of the Hashemite dynasty in Jordan. And the cousin of the king was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Rad al-Hussein. And I must say, I don't think very highly of Zaid Rad al-Hussein either. I consider both to be opportunists and both to be individuals without very solid moral or ethical scruples. Going back to your statement about the Arabs abandoning the Palestinians. Well, they've been doing that for the last 70 years. Because I think the behavior of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt and the others vis-a-vis the Palestinians has been a disgrace. And much of it is because of American bullying and American
aid,
blackmailing. I mean, money is a curse. It's better not to have it, actually, than to be bound.
The United States gives Jordan, almost $2 billion a year.
Yeah. And of course, when you receive money, you become subject to blackmail. You would become subject to pressures that otherwise you would not suffer. And unfortunately, Trump is someone who will abuse this power. And I expect him to abuse this power. But sometimes it is best to suffer the consequences, but simply to say no. I mean, this is a question of principle.
Mm-hmm.
This is a question of the right to the homeland of the Palestinian people. You're not going to throw all of international law in the bin. I mean, if you were to allow the resettlement of the Palestinians, you would throw in the bin any number of United Nations judgments,
Mm-hmm.
judgments of the International Court of Justice. It would make actually the pending case, South Africa against Israel, moot.
Mm-hmm.
It would make it meaningless, irrelevant, if you can bypass the International Court of Justice. So, in this situation, I think international solidarity is necessary. The Arab League and Egypt and Saudi Arabia,
Mm-hmm.
Turkey, Iraq must take a position and say, we won't let it happen. And there would be consequences if you're trying to do it. And as I said, last point, let's have the International Court of Justice issue an order in the pending case. The case is already pending. Issue an order forbidding any resettlement as contrary to international law, and then recommend that states, because all states are bound by the ICJ, recommend to states to break commercial relations with Israel, to finally apply some meaningful pressure against a state that is in open rebellion against international law.
Take us out, if you would please, a quick tribute to your dear friend and the loss, Professor Francis Boyle.
Yes, who was not only in the context of Palestine, but also in the context of indigenous rights, in the context of the rights of Alaska indigenous and Hawaii indigenous and Rapa Nui indigenous. He leaves an enormous loss, he leaves a legacy of fantastic books.
Mm-hmm.
But I had counted on his support, and he supported us. I am in the directorate of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute. And we drafted a 30-page legal brief demanding that the International Criminal Court investigate the issue of complicity in genocide, in particular with regard to the European Union, because the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen have given military, political, economic, diplomatic support to a genocidal state. That must have consequences. And our 30-page brief, I can send it to you.
Please do.
It's something that I think should be better known. There was a bit of publicity on the 25th of May 2024 when we presented it in The Hague. But after that, no follow-up, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You say, oh gosh, this is interesting. A case against Ursula von der Leyen. And then nothing more. It's simply filed away and forgotten. So that is the situation we're living in. We're living in a dysfunctional legal context. And what we need is effective mechanisms for the enforcement of international judgments and for decisions of international tribunals. And again, my heart goes out to all the victims in Gaza, in Israel. Also, I mean, I'm a pacifist. I don't want war anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
In Ukraine, in Russia. And one last word. I wrote a longish article in Counterpunch on the 27th of February 2024, dedicated to the memory of Aaron Bushnell,
Mm-hmm.
a U.S. airman who self-immolated
Mm-hmm.
outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. It was an excruciatingly painful video to watch.
Yes.
6 times Aaron Bushnell shouted, "Free Palestine, free Palestine." The last 2 times you could hear that he was in enormous pain because he was one big flame.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all filmed. And people tend to forget. I don't. I'm a practicing Catholic. I had a mass said for his soul.
Mm.
And I will again this year on the anniversary
Mm-hmm.
of his death, 25th of February. I will have a mass said on the memory of Aaron Bushnell. And I ask all listeners to do the same in their respective churches, to think about him, to think about the loss of this human life. But as he himself said before lighting himself up, my suffering is nothing in comparison to what the Palestinian people have had to endure. And if this helps raise the consciousness of the American people, then it is meaningful. And if we had a free press, if we had a responsible press, if we had a press with conscience, people would have realized
Mm-hmm.
the magnitude of the crime of genocide being committed in Palestine. But we have a press that is complicit, a press that engages in Islamophobia, a press that engages in creating fear and hatred.
Professor Alfred de Zayas, thank you. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate your time. I hope I haven't started a fight with your wife. That's a fight I don't want to have. Thank her for her indulgence on my behalf.
Indeed. So,
And look,
what I do.
good night, my dear brother, and look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Piano Man, I think you got your Ursula von der Leyen question answered. Folks, in my humble opinion, that one right there, all of you who have been so gracious to join us and stay with us, I honestly would ask, A, hit the like button, and B, send a copy of this to your distribution, because that analysis, folks, was nothing but the truth. I got to thank Professor de Zayas for joining us today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. We got Ebony Bago is going to join us tomorrow. Stay tuned. New episode tomorrow with Ebony. She's in the press corps, in the White House press corps. Ebony Bago is going to join us. Please follow, subscribe. Again, do everybody copy this link and send it to your distribution out networks, because that right there, folks, was nothing but the truth. Follow us on social media. Find all the links below. This is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Remember, the talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all again next time. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.